Thank you. I've got students from Dr. Brownell's American Presidency course with me today to discuss the topic of historicizing the presidential election. We got Jane Srinivasan, Max Beery, and Mallory Wells. Thanks for being here, guys, and discussing what you are learning in class and applying it to the presidential election. My first question for you today is going to be comparing the candidates to candidates of previous elections. Are you seeing that these candidates and this election is unique, or are there similarities from past elections? Jane, we can start with you.
Yeah, so for Trump specifically, I feel like he's taking this populist approach where he's appealing to the people, and he's like, oh, I'm a man of the people, right? And I feel like that kind of aligns with Andrew Jackson in the 1820s, as well as Ronald Reagan in the 80s, because, I mean, both of them were trying to get that mass appeal. I'm one of these people, you know, even though Trump's from, you know, a pretty rich background, he still is kind of portraying himself like that.
Max?
Yeah, in terms of candidates, there's not really a lot in history that are like Donald Trump. There's not been a single president who has not had political experience prior to coming into office like he didn't going into 2016. As for Kamala Harris, Harris is kind of what you would kind of describe as more of a traditional Democrat in the last 20 to 30 years. She's kind of in the realm of like the Bill Clintons and, you know, the Barack Obamas. So kind of more traditional on the Democrat side, but for the Republican side, obviously with Trump, he's got experience now, but he originally didn't have experience. So it's interesting to see how that plays out.
Yeah. All right.
Well, I feel as if, like, especially in the case of Donald Trump, as he said, as my fellow classmates said, like, we're kind of on like this fast track towards like more of like the celebrity president, like especially with my own personal experiences. Donald Trump specifically has been like a massive celebrity, I suppose, that I'm not exactly sure how to word it, but I feel as if there is a point where he is trying to like outshine Kamala Harris in a way, and like just with like all the attention that things have been getting in recent news, I think that's definitely the case.
Absolutely. And do you guys think that there's a time in presidential history that has been more polarized than today, or have there been moments in the nation's history when we have been as divided as we kind of feel we are?
So I think obviously before the Civil War, you have the 1850s where, you know, you have the South like strongly wanting their states' rights for slavery compared to the North. And then you have that post-Civil War era as well, where it's kind of like, it's fractured. You kind of have the South that's hurt from everything, like economically as well as emotionally, and they're recovering, and then they kind of have this animosity towards the North, and you have kind of a division there in that time period.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I would totally agree. Other than the last couple elections, there really hasn't been anything where the two candidates are so far apart in terms of ideology. The bases, they basically don't see eye to eye on anything. Obviously, like he just said, the Civil War is the main culprit for a very polarized election. But in terms of modern day, this is kind of the run-of-the-mill of American politics at this point. And it's interesting to see how in the future it will be. I assume that we're going to go back to more centralized candidates, more closer to the middle, but obviously only time will tell.
Yes, this is probably the most intense and polarizing election. Like, I think we have all experienced, like, again, you know, 1850s Civil War, like, that's kind of where it has started. But right now, it is the most polarizing, I believe.
And then the next president is likely going to be facing with conflicts outside of our nation as well, especially with Ukraine and the Middle East. Kind of tell me about the roles that the president plays when it comes to foreign affairs, and the roles that presidents in the past have played with dealing with major world conflicts.
Yeah, so obviously this Middle Eastern issue has been like a problem since the end of World War II probably, especially U.S.'s involvement in it. So, I mean, going into each election cycle, each president has had to deal with this issue over and over again. And I think like there's a lot of precedent for what Kamala or Trump has to do from now on, because, I mean, like, this is a cliche, but history is a cycle, and we keep seeing this with the Middle East, where Gaza keeps getting attacked again, and then you keep having conflicts with Russia trying to take over like extra territory, like we mentioned in Ukraine. So yeah, I feel like that there's a lot of precedent for that. A lot of presidents in the past have had to deal with this issue as well. Yeah.
Yeah, I would say in terms of presidents in the past, Lyndon B. Johnson taking on Vietnam and kind of pushing America more into Vietnam. The United States general public really likes to win everything. So in terms of going into wars that are already ongoing as a president, you kind of have to have a policy for either we're going to get out or we are going to win another way, like in Obama's 2012 re-election. Obviously with Iraq and Afghanistan, he did have troop withdrawals, but then he also increased drone striking and strategic target striking as well as counterterrorism efforts. So he still had a winning plan, but he was able to get more troops out. So basically having a winning game plan going into the election is probably their best bet.
I think, especially with the example of Lyndon B. Johnson, with America's involvement in the Vietnam War, like some people have the argument that it pretty much destroyed Lyndon B. Johnson's like intentions towards like domestic affairs as well. So there's going to have to be some kind of balance, especially with foreign wars, foreign affairs, and like keeping things like normal, I suppose, like in the U.S. itself.
Yeah, and let me ask a little bit about the candidates as well. Has integrity. Has integrity really mattered with a presidential candidate in the past? And can lies or misleading political attacks kind of affect a presidential campaign as well?
Yeah, I think that's been the case since like the beginning of the United States. Like if you look at the Jefferson versus Adams election in 1800, like you had Adams accusing Jefferson of being atheist, which was a big deal back then. You had Jefferson accusing Adams of being a monarchist, obviously controversial after splitting from Britain. And then like even if you look at like more modern times, like after Nixon, after the Watergate scandal, you had Jimmy Carter basically running entirely on integrity. So that was a big part of his campaign. I think that can help people win elections, as we saw with Jimmy Carter.
Yeah, reestablishing integrity in an office that is perceived to be kind of devalued a little bit is definitely very important in presidential elections. Obviously, one of the main examples is John F. Kennedy in the 1960 election, just his image as just John F. Kennedy. I mean, he was a man who was honest, had a lot of integrity, had charisma, things like that. That was very important for his victory in 1960.
Well, I suppose, again, as some other people have said, like since the dawn of time, essentially, since the beginning of the United States, like integrity has always been sort of integral. Like you can't, like in a modern context, you can't be populist, but also be a liar in a way, especially like, say like the late 1800s in a way, like mud raking, mud slinging, like those concepts. Like if you are proven to be a liar in a way, then that takes away the public's trust in you.
Yeah, and to broaden that question as well, what qualities are very attractive and good for candidates trying to get into this office as well, and what flaws have also been pretty pivotal to maybe not getting them to the election bid?
Yeah, I think the most obvious one is charisma, right? You had Obama, JFK, Reagan, basically like, maybe not Obama, but you saw it with Reagan, maybe like someone like Bill Clinton. They're able to reach over the aisle because of how charismatic they are. And then another thing I think is important is you have someone like FDR who stepped up in a time of need, and then also Truman as well when FDR passed away at the end of World War II. Like proving that you can deal with the pressure, you can handle a really tough situation. I think that gives you a really good chance for re-election.
Yeah, I mean those are all true, but there are times where different qualities are needed by different candidates, and obviously with the different parties, some different qualities are needed. In times of crisis, you're going to look for somebody that has very strong leadership, someone that is on good standing with international leaders. If you are in a time of relative economic dribble or recession or anything, you need someone who is understanding and cares for the American people, and they show that in their rhetoric. So it is obviously you want someone who's strong, you want someone with a lot of charisma, but it's not exactly just that tooth and nail to the end. You do have to kind of switch with your party's lines.
Yeah, it depends really, really strongly on historical context. Like if it's a time of crisis, then absolutely directness is very, very important. Like someone needs to make harsh and tough decisions like very, very quickly, like or else there will be consequences. But again, in times of peace, you also need to have someone who's willing to like nurture the domestic in a way, like someone who is able to sort of take care of the American people when there really isn't a need for conflict.
Yeah. And let's pivot now. As you know, today is November 1st, and October just passed us. and I want to ask a little bit about this political phenomenon called an October surprise. Can you tell me what an October surprise is and maybe some historical October surprises that have happened in the past?
Yeah, so an October surprise is basically like right before the election in October, as it's like in the first week of November, right, the main election. There's something major that happens that changes the game, right? So I think this was coined in 1980 by Ronald Reagan's campaign advisor. So basically, Jimmy Carter was rumored to have, so the Iran hostage crisis was going on at the time. So he was rumored to have announced a deal with Iran to basically free the hostages, but Reagan's campaign had kind of portrayed it as a political ploy instead of actually helping the people, because he thought that if Jimmy Carter had freed the Iran hostages, he would be able to get a major swing in his way. So, but that never happened. So, I mean, October surprise was just a phrase coined for that.
Yeah, and in terms of other October surprises, in 1972, when Nixon was running against George McGovern, he, in October, said that they were reaching near peace in Vietnam, which was really not true, obviously, as to what history tells. But obviously, those types of things are very effective for voters, and the show don't tell type of politics is not really existent, just because in terms of showing, it's a process. There's things that, we have to have troops come out first, and then we can get to peace talks. But I'm not saying that Nixon wouldn't have won if he didn't say that, but it couldn't have hurt.
My example from 2000 isn't like any sort of international affair, but it's when like George W. Bush, like the younger one, got a DUI, like during like his campaign trail in a way. Because if you're able to show, like, if there is a flaw that is shown during a campaign, that has the potential to be devastating in a way. And even though, George W. Bush was able to like make that apology and still like clinch a win in a way, like it's still showing like the personal flaws of a candidate.
Yeah, and George W. Bush always had a lot of baggage with that as well, with being like his father's son and whatnot too. I want to kind of ask a little bit about just changing gears a little bit. We don't have a third party, or at least not a major third party candidate for this ticket. We do have RFK, who's still on the ballot in many states, but he's ended his campaign as well. I want to ask you guys, what is the role of a third party candidate in this kind of modern or maybe even historical presidential cycles, and have they really ever made a difference in the past?
I mean, yeah, definitely. I think even if you look at something like 2016, where you had Gary Johnson, Jill Stein, right? Like, apparently there's like a stat that if a lot of the Jill Stein voters voted for Hillary, she would have won in a bunch of major swing states, right? So obviously they can make a big change. But I think in this presidential election, we had RFK leading up to it, and it kind of felt like he was more of a symbolic thing. Like, I don't like either of the candidates, so I'm going to vote for this guy. And that's the role that they played in a lot of elections in the past too. Not saying that they haven't been a major player before, but yeah, I think in recent times it's kind of become a symbolic vote.
Yeah, and historically they have mattered. In 1912, it was Woodrow Wilson and Teddy Roosevelt and William Howard Taft. Roosevelt ran as a progressive because the Republican Party didn't give him the nomination because they were going with the incumbent Taft, and Roosevelt took almost all their votes and took nearly all the electoral votes from the Republicans, and then that led to Woodrow Wilson getting elected, which, obviously history is not looked favorably upon Woodrow Wilson anymore, but those types of things do matter. And Ross Perot in the 90s, that was a big one where he got 11% of the vote, but he still didn't get any electoral votes. I think in terms of modern context, third parties matter, but not in terms of getting electoral votes or pulling votes away from people. Honestly, I think third parties are starting to become kind of a rebound for more extremist views and like donors. Like David Duke in 2016, former Ku Klux Klan Grand Wizard, he supported Trump. This election cycle, he's supporting Jill Stein. I don't think they have much in common, but I just don't think he wants to go in terms of, I don't want to help either of these candidates because I think neither of them are good.
Yeah, with third-party candidates, they were a lot more important. They held a little bit more like legitimate, like tangible weight, like again, like say in 1912. Like, and nowadays, I feel as if third candidates have become sort of like the lesser of two evils in a way, except there's like 3, 4, how many there are during any particular presidential cycle. Like with a lot of people, it's like you can't bear to sort of live with the guilt of like voting for, say, like Donald Trump or Hillary Clinton in 2016, like say you wanted to vote for Gary Johnson because you hated like both the Republican and Democratic candidate. I've seen that a lot, especially with people that like I have had classes with or like had an actual political discussion with.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for your time today. That's all that we have allotted for today. But thank you again to our guests, Jan, Max, and Mallory for being with us today. And thank you for watching Washington. See you next time.